Hello, this is Ralph K. Ginorio. Welcome to the 27th installment of my video adaptation of my historical background to the 9/11 terror atrocities lessons. We have come to the critical years of 1972 and 1973. Before this time, Israel has established its absolute dominance over the Arabs. For 20 years, from 1947 through 1967, whenever the Arabs and the Israelis clashed in open warfare, even with the full power of the Egyptian army, the Syrian army, the Jordanian army, and a bunch of irregular terrorist forces, or irregular guerrilla forces, should I say, the Israelis proved again and again that the Arabs were no match for them on the open field of battle. So in 1972, a new tactic is going to be tried in a more dramatic way than ever before, and in 1973, the entire situation is going to change, and the modern war on terror will actually begin. Not in 2001, in 1973. Here we go. Since they cannot destroy, they believe, the Israelis in open combat, at least not yet, many in the Arab world decide that irregular warfare, asymmetrical warfare, or terrorism is the way to go. Now, what is terrorism and how is it distinguished from other forms of human activity? Well, terrorism uses a lot of the methodologies that organized crime uses. You have criminal conspiracies to do all sorts of nasty things, and you do it underground, you do it secretly, you do it with strong attention to preventing anyone from knowing what you're doing, you limit information to the participants, and like organized crime, you basically live off the land in a parasitical fashion, taking what you can get, whether they be opportunities or resources. But what distinguishes terrorism from organized crime is government support. And in the atmosphere of the Cold War, governments like the Soviet Union and its KGB, or the United States and our CIA, were willing to fund terror organizations as a means of competing with one another, short of full-scale Soviet-American war. And in the Middle East, oil revenues were beginning to give the Arab governments serious coin. And they began to spend this coin on organizations like the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Well, in 1972, at the Olympic Games, which were held in Munich, Germany, which was a big deal back then. After all, the last German Olympics had been in 1936. They were presided over by Adolf Hitler. Most Americans are taught in classrooms that what was significant about 1936 was Jesse Owens, the African-American runner, beating all the Germans. Well, that was one thing that happened, and it was something that you could look at sort of as a high point, but in reality, it was a Nazi stage show designed to take the world's attention and show them a Nazi version of reality. And it was a big public relations boost for Hitler. So to go to Germany, less than, 27 years after the end of World War II, to Munich, where Hitler started out, where the Beer Hall Putsch took place in 1923, that was a big leap for the International Olympic Committee to make. So already there were controversies because, for example, the athletes of Israel were going to Germany, and they were going to be guarded and protected and guaranteed by German security forces. Given what Germany had done to the Jews, it was a hard sell. But, you know, it's the Olympics. Until a bunch of Palestinian terrorists took the Israeli athletes hostage. And in a very public way, executed them all. I remember Howard Cosell going on the air, I was a child, saying that the athletes were dead, that they were all dead. This is the introduction of many Americans to this thing called terrorism. And what Americans tended to draw from this was that there were murderous forces in the world that used politics as an excuse for doing the most heinous things. Capturing and murdering athletes, planting bombs in school buses, hijacking aircraft. This is not what George Washington did. George Washington chose to fight the enemy in the field wearing a uniform. Most Americans understand the distinction between a war of independence where you fight military to military, even if you do use the countryside and the woods to your advantage, and using criminal and assassination methods primarily, hiding amongst civilians as civilians until you plant bombs and kill other civilians in the name of terror. Well, the Munich Massacre of 1972 was an introduction for many in the Western world to Islamic terror. But there was a mistake in the calculus. The Egyptians, under their new president, Anwar al-Sadat, had a plan to avenge the humiliation of 1967. Now, the Egyptian army is an interesting institution. It's played a central role, at least since the British left in the early 1950s, in Egyptian politics. Most recently, it has saved Egypt from an Islamic Brotherhood government that was in the process of massacring the Christians of Egypt and preparing to bring the Egyptian army back into the field against the Israelis. The Egyptian army, again and again, has stepped up to the plate and has proven itself the most effective institution within Egypt and a guarantor of national security and perhaps the national good, depending upon your point of view. So in 1973, Sadat and the Egyptian army is ready to earn its place again at the top of the heap. And their plan ultimately comes out as the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And it is the beginning of the modern war on terror. Here's the story. The Israeli army has established a line of fortifications along the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. Named for its general, it is called the Bar-Lev Line. The Israelis also maintain defensive positions in the Golan Heights overlooking Syria, a hill country northeast of the Sea of Galilee. The Israelis occupy the West Bank. Now, the most effective of the Arab armies by far is Egypt. And what Egypt does, it's as amazing as what the Chinese do during the first year of the Korean War, when they infiltrated over 1 million men through our lines without us even really knowing they were there. For months leading up to the October attack, the Egyptian army seemed to be engaged in normal maneuvers. There were training troops that came up, they took their positions, and then they left. The Israelis saw the trucks come and the trucks go, and they seemed to be filled with as many troops both ways. But what the Egyptians were actually doing was secreting these forces in hidden bunkers on their side. And they were slowly but very, very effectively building up a numerical superiority fit for an attack. They were also flooding the area with artillery and missiles and special equipment. Now, the Israeli Defense Force got some wind, but their political leadership did not take it seriously, and the military leadership did not take it seriously. And we were approaching the High Holy Day of Atonement, which caused, since it seemed to be peaceful, the Israeli Defense Force to allow a significant percentage of its people to go home on leave, to spend leave practicing their religious devotions with their family, friends, and loved ones. So basically a screening or skeleton force was left to defend the Bar-Lev line and the positions in the Golan Heights, and people went home. And suddenly, like lightning, the Egyptians struck. They used water cannon, like on fireboats. And these water cannon were targeted on the first stage of the Bar-Lev line, which was a huge sand berm. Well, sand can hold up to and absorb artillery and machine guns, but it has difficulty holding up against high-pressure water. So the Egyptians were able to put holes at will in the Bar-Lev line. And then prearranged bridging equipment had the Egyptians crossing into the Bar-Lev fortifications and behind the Israelis. The attack was carried out with a high degree of competency, And the Israeli military was shocked and caught flat-footed. In fact, wrong-footed. So the Israelis' fortification, the Bar-Lev line, turned out not to be much protection at all. And at the same time, the Syrians began a series of more conventional attacks into the Golan Heights. Again, the Israelis were unprepared for this. So as the Syrians come in from the north, and the Egyptians from the south, the Israelis do the most natural and predictable thing in the world. They take their French-built Air Force, supported to some extent by American technology, and they sweep over the battlefield. To compensate for Egyptian dominance on the ground, the Israelis are going to use air-land combat and dominate from the air. It's a trap. The Israeli Air Force over the Bar-Lev line becomes like a sky full of stars, and each star an exploding Israeli fighter. It was a trap. The Soviet doctrine of battle in 1972 was, if it flies, it dies. And the Egyptians had amassed such a stockpile of anti-aircraft artillery and anti-aircraft missiles that to go into this region was almost a death sentence if you were an Israeli pilot. So Israeli air power is nullified over the field of battle, and suddenly the Israelis realize they're wide open. If the Egyptians attack through Sinai towards Jerusalem, they could punch through. Meanwhile, the Syrians are punching through in the north. The Israelis begin to get desperate. Shh! I'm about to tell you a secret. Israel, in 1973, had nuclear weapons. They still do. And these nuclear weapons are a last-minute assurance against conquest. The Egyptian army, after gaining control of the Bar-Lev fortifications, decides, like Israel in 1967, that it's going to go beyond its original battle plan. And suddenly, Egyptian tank armies are on the march to the heart of Israel. With Egyptian armies penetrating from the south and Syrian armies penetrating from the north, the Israelis prepare their atomic reprisal. Now that atomic reprisal could take the form of mushroom clouds appearing over the Egyptian and Syrian tank armies, or it could take the form of mushroom clouds appearing over an atomized Cairo, capital of Egypt, and Damascus, capital of Syria. Now, if Israel were to have used its atomic weapons, it is incredibly likely that the Arab world, the Third World, the anti-Western world, and much of the Western world, especially on the left, would have cried bloody murder, and the Soviets might have been encouraged to directly intervene, possibly with its own weapons of mass destruction, against Israel. Had the Russians intervened in the Arab-Israeli conflict, we certainly, the United States of America, would have intervened ourselves. We talk about here an escalation that could result in nuclear Armageddon, World War III. President Nixon saw this, and he decided to prevent it the only way he knew how. He established an emergency airlift to Israel, sending them medical supplies and weapons. He also provided the Israeli General Staff with American satellite images in as close to real time as we could get in 1972, which pinpointed how strung out the Egyptians actually were, and the Syrians, and helped the Israelis to plan counterattacks. Within the next week or two, Israel used these new American resources and counterattacked back to the Bar-Lev line, and even in places over the line into Egypt, and counterattacked in the Golan as well. Again, ceasefire by the United Nations stops the fighting. Had the United Nations organization existed in the 1860s, no doubt there would have been a ceasefire brokered and the Confederate States of America would still be around. The war ends. The war ends with an Israeli victory. But at that moment, any thinking person on the Arab side understands something. So long as the United States exists as a power with the ability to intervene, there is no way that we will allow Israel to fall. Once that lesson is proven in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, we become the main enemy of the Islamists. Israel, the little Satan. The United States, the great Satan. Because we will not allow postage stamp-sized Israel to fall. They conveniently ignore the fact that President Nixon, by making the Israelis less desperate, also probably stopped nuclear weapons from being used on Arab armies or on Arab civil populations. But, shh, Israel isn't supposed to have atomic weapons. So at that moment, in 1973, we become the main enemy. And if you look at the history, and I'm going to explain it, from then until now, you will see more and more the United States becomes the central target, Israel a subsidiary target. Why try to fight the hand when you have to deal with the whole body? You'd better take on the whole body. So we become the main enemy. And the first expression of this main enemy-dom isn't military. The first expression of this is economic. Late in 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, establishes the first Arab oil embargo. Suddenly, the American economy is crippled. Without sufficient oil reserves, we're going to run out of oil post-haste. We start rationing, and the price of everything goes up. Now, eventually, the Arabs start selling oil to us again, but at ridiculously inflated prices, and they never go back. And the Arabs appreciate that while we may protect Israel, they have a whip hand against us. Now, what effect does this have? Well, consider this. The story told in most American classrooms is that feminism finally came into its own in 1970s America, and we understood the badness of keeping women down, so women were able to enter the workforce in huge numbers thanks to movement feminism. Not quite right. Before the Arab oil embargo, the average man was able to bring home a salary that would support his family. A paperback book before 1973 was about just under $1. Gas, under $1. Flash forward to 1979, to the second Arab oil embargo under Jimmy Carter during the Iran hostage crisis. And by this time, the economic effects of the oil embargo and of the inflated price of oil has really had a chance to play into the American economy. The average paperback book is close to $5. And the average gallon of gas, well over $1. Everything that's shipped by gasoline is more expensive. Everything like this pen made of plastic, which is a petroleum product, is more expensive. There isn't a thing in our economy that is not shipped by plane, train, or truck. Petroleum-using vehicles. So with the price of every commodity that we need, every good and service going up, do you think our salaries went up? Oh yeah, in an inflationary, reactive way, but not at a commensurate rate. The only way for the average American family to pay to maintain or improve the living standard that they had before the first Arab oil embargo was to bring in extra income. Now that could be done if you get a better job, but for many people it involved either the man taking a second job part-time or the woman going into the workforce. One of the reasons why women go into the workforce in the 1970s is to maintain living standards in order to compensate for the reduced buying power caused as a direct result of the Arab oil embargoes. It's not the only reason. Home conveniences that make it no longer necessary to have somebody full-time at home make it possible. And yes, movement feminism does convince enough people, a critical mass in the culture, that it is simply wrong to bar an entire gender of people from opportunities that they might have. And during the 1970s, the American family as a unit begins to crumble. All of these factors together. But the oil embargo is a powerful thing. So 1973 is really when the contemporary world begins. It's when the War on Terror begins. And it's when the elevated oil prices change American society and lifestyles forever. See you next time.